Good evening. Welcome to the first webinar of 2018 for Ontario Soccer Player Development. We're delighted to have Dr. Martin Toms, who's a senior lecturer of coaching and sports science at the University of Birmingham. Martin is joining us live today from Birmingham, England. So it's 11:30 p.m. his time, but we're obviously delighted to have him staying with us, and obviously joining us this evening. So his presentation, his webinar tonight will be on multi-sports versus early specialization. Please feel free to ask questions in the question box and we'll address them at the end. But for now, I'll hand you over to Martin.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for the introduction, and Happy New Year to all of you. Yeah, as Dave said, it's 11:30 p.m. here, so it's way past my bedtime, but I'm delighted to be here and be able to contribute. As I spoke last year at the summit, I wanted to just cover some of the issues around sort of specialization and multi-sport opportunity, I guess, and look at the research that's based around that. So what I'm going to look at is this idea of diversification, so playing multiple sports versus specialization, and what the evidence is, as well as some of the newer work that's been published recently in soccer in particular, and a little bit in youth soccer. So I want to try and establish an opportunity or a forum for discussion, debate, and to share ideas at the same time, because I think one of the key things with this webinar approach is to allow people the opportunity to put in context where they come from, and also think about what the key issues are that you face as clubs, as individuals, as coaches. So hopefully that'll start this debate and discussion that hopefully will be ongoing. Those of you who were at the summit or have seen some of the work that I do, I'm very much in favour of looking at the engagement of kids in sports. I think that's really important, that we need to make sure that we get as much engagement from them and as much participation as possible, because we are only the caretakers of our activity. So it's these kids that are coming through are going to be the future players at any level, the future coaches, the future administrators. So we need to make sure that we keep as many of these kids in the game as possible. And the way we need to do that is by giving the best experience and the best opportunity as possible. And this is where we have some of the issues with specialization across the world. It's not a national issue, it's a global issue. And we need to be aware of what the research evidence is, while people try and push their kids too early, too young, into focusing on one sport. So my view and my opinion is very much this, if you like, as an analogy for it. So if your child could only study one subject at school, you'd worry about their development and the missed opportunities for them to learn new skills. So why, for some sports coaches, is early specialization perceived as acceptable? So one of the things I try and argue, and I will be arguing based on the broader evidence, is the importance of wider sporting skills and later specialization and diversification, multi-sports, if you like, as a way of kids learning skills to ensure that they can have a broader diet of sports, work out what sport they're best at, but also learn skills that transfer between sports. And that's where the research is now going, and I think that's a really important thing, that you can gain things from playing other sports, and we need to bear that in mind when we talk about multi-sport activity. The other thing I think is worth bearing in mind is, when you look at the context of sport, we often discuss participation in three different worlds, if you like: a biological, so the body; the psychological, as in the mental side of sport; but also the social, so the context becomes really important. So I was part of a group that reviewed all of the research around this 8 years ago now, and we looked at this issue, and I actually think now in retrospect that we've got this slightly wrong. because I think that what we need to bear in mind is that the biological and the psychological, the body and the mental side, happens within a particular socio-cultural context. So we need that setting and that context to then be able to understand what the children that we engage with also need. So those of you that are in urban areas versus those of you that are in rural areas, the differences, the nuances will be very important. And there's an awful lot of work out there, particularly by colleagues down at Queen's like Jean Coté, who talk about actually the location becomes really, really important, and it has a big impact on developing elite performance. So the type of area, the type of town, the opportunities that you have, the other sports around you that you can experience give kids a better opportunity. So we need to manage that and understand that at a very local level. So whilst we might be talking at a macro level here, the key is for you to think about how you can apply this on a micro level. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So we need to think about that. And I think that's one of the problems with a lot of the research that's out there. People just take it on board without giving it a context. So a couple of things to think about and have in the back of your mind throughout this webinar. So a few key terms. Key things that I'll mention, and these are just things you may want to make a quick note of if you're not sure, just so we can cover them as we go through. About early engagement. What we mean by early engagement is when kids engage with a particular sport at a young age, for example, at under 7 level. So kids at a young age are playing that sport, be it in a semi-organized club structure, even to some extent with their friends. So they have an experience of that activity, so they can learn the fundamental rules, the understanding, the basis of that activity. We are talking about, for most of this, where we talk about kids focusing on one sport from a young age. And again, I've given an example of under 11 here, purely because in the UK, because of our educational structure, and we start secondary school, so we have primary schools and secondary schools, then it tends to be 11 or 12 where we suddenly find some kids are pushed to specialize in one sport. And this, I think, is one of those important cultural nuances. So in countries that have a junior, middle and high school system, the age groups, the social context, the educational context, the peer context and structure of sport will be slightly different. So we need to put all of this into that particular context. So really, specialization is focusing on one sport only from a young age. We focus on a number of sports until mid-teens. And that may be playing 3 or 4 sports across a year, and not focusing on one entirely until a later age. So from my perspective, it was thinking seasonally, it was very much for me rugby union, football and cricket, and a little bit of tennis over the winter, summer and winter activities. So playing a number of sports over that time at club level, at recreational level at the same time. So it's focusing on that, and normally until the mid-teens. One sport from the mid-teen period. So we're going to try and cover the whole range of activity in here through some of the research that's out there that's been published. So those are basically the key terms that we're going to talk about in this. One of the things that we are noticing an awful lot now in the UK is a push towards parents encouraging their children to engage at a very, very young age in sport and activity. And there's an awful lot that you can see in social media. I've noticed very recently a new organisation in the UK trying to match kids from the age of 5 onwards with elite clubs as a way of identifying talent. And you can't help but be cynical about that, especially when you look at the research a little bit later on. But we had one fairly famous example of this last year in the UK that was made famous on social media by particular groups and particular individuals. Fulham FC. Now, Fulham FC put this advert out, and this is something I showed at the summit last year. They put this advert out there to talk about this idea about a pre-academy talent identification day. So they were effectively trying to get the talented youngsters before any other club did. And I think the issue that a lot of us had with this is that they talk about pre-academy talent identification, and yet fives and under sixes. Now, if anybody listening is able to spot talent in an under 5 or under 6 player, then I take my hat off to you. But it's the sort of thing that becomes hugely problematic because we start a chronological arms race. At what age do we start looking at this in that basis? 5 and 6 year olds shouldn't be going to a talent day. They should be playing football, absolutely, but there should be no indication about identifying talent at that age, because to put it frankly, you can't. Kids are still developing. If you look at the American government, I think it's the CDC over there or whatever it is, they have particular milestones for 5 and 6 year olds, and a lot of those milestones are being able to skip, jump, walk, and go to the toilet unaided at that age. So how on earth you can identify talent, I have no idea. But what was even more concerning was about their preferred position. So I don't know if any of you have 5 or 6 year olds that you coach or aware of who know what position they want to play, and perhaps you'd like to ask them and see what they come up with. I famously or infamously said last year at the summit, I asked my brother what my nephew wanted to be at 5 or 6, and my brother just said he wanted to be a dinosaur. So how on earth that fits in with this sort of idea and level of engagement? But what this advert did do, did start a big debate over here about, should we even be thinking about talent at that sort of age, and does it even exist? So we need to be very careful about this chronological arms race. We have to be. At what age should we then start suggesting to parents that they should be focusing on one sport only? And more importantly, what does the evidence say? And maybe when we get to this level of actually prenatal talent identification, I'm sure there will be snake oil salesmen out there trying to sell ideas that we can test from the way your unborn child kicks whether they're going to play sport and whether they're going to be good at sport. But we've got to be very, very careful of that as coaches, as academics, as people involved in sport. We have a responsibility to make sure that parents are aware of what the evidence is and what we need to know about all of this. And that brings me on to the sort of the first real issue, the concerns and beliefs that are out there. Certainly there is a focus from many parents that the earlier their child starts, the more likely they are to succeed as an adult. Now, there are obviously going to be a very, very few cases of this, but the majority of cases, this doesn't happen. So focusing early, particularly in sports or activities where you need that child to develop particular skills over a period of time, it is very, very difficult to do that. Yes, you may be able to do something like this on reading skills, on language skills, on things like that, but physically it's very, very difficult. So we need to be aware of this. We need to warn parents that actually focusing at a young age is more likely to lead to dropout and burnout. The use of anecdote as evidence. And parents are wonderful at this. They will always put in oh, so and so did it at a young age, they started playing young, but they don't always know the story about what else that child did. And yes, Tiger Woods, as you know, did start playing golf. He was swinging a golf club at the age of 2, but he also did an awful lot of other stuff as well. So we've got to be very careful that parents don't come back, or even coaches or anybody involved in the game don't come back and use anecdote as evidence for this. We've also got to be careful of the issues to do with perceptions from other countries. So, for example, the Eastern European and communist talent systems, where you will see hundreds and hundreds of kids engaging in a physical activity in certain sports, and then finding that one of them won a gold medal at the Olympic Games without realizing what the cost was of all those people. So a huge number of kids go into a system and only a very, very few ever come out. So the idea of them being seen as playing sport is always awkward and always difficult. The other issue we have is that systems that promote early specialization will always have athletes who achieve it. So our sample automatically is biased. And this historically has been very much the system in England with soccer. So you look at all of the academies in England, and until recently, until this evidence has come to light, until recently they were saying, well, actually, no, you have to start young. And if you want to become a footballer, you have to choose football over all other sports, which means that we have created a very average international team, as you probably well know. Because actually what we're doing is we're losing talented kids from other sports, and we're actually forcing them to do this one activity, which leads to dropout and burnout and various other things. Now, recently you'll be aware that that England won the Under-17 World Cup over in India. There is a roundabout, or there's a school of thinking that we only think maybe 4 or 5 of those players will make it to Premiership level, because they are still developing and people change. If you go back and look at previous international squads at age group, you will see that actually not all of them will ever succeed at a high level. So we have to be really, really careful about how we get that message across. We also need to be aware that if you're going to look at elite maturity, then we have to wait until athletes are at least 16 years of age. Now, the Australian system, they had a fantastic talent identification system for sports when they had the Olympic Games back in 2000. And they actually realized how much of a waste of money it was afterwards, and they scrapped it because they realized that there's no point in throwing a huge amount of money into young kids playing performance to become elite performers, because they change by the time they're 16, 18. You may as well allow them to play, and that at that later age, you can identify the talent. So we need to be aware of some of these key issues. But these issues are symptomatic because we have the sort of the Asian tiger parent approach, where parents trying to give their kids the edge will often push and push at a young age, and they will try and give these kids a label of being elite at a young age. Now we still have quite a bit of debate here on this. Is it a good thing to be able to say that your child played elite level football at the age of 7 or 8, or is that a problematic thing? The jury's out, I think, on that. But what we have to be aware of, that society generally is pressuring people, and social media are, to start younger, compete younger, and try and make it. And particularly, we have less of an issue of this in the UK, but particularly in the US, and I'm not sure about Canada, but the pursuit of scholarships becomes really important. Not just scholarships at college or university, but also scholarships at school. And we just have to be quite aware of what that can do to young athletes, and issues to do with dropout that come in, and the danger of pushing at such a young age becomes problematic for the future of sport. It's a bit like, thinking of another analogy, it's a bit like having, oh, I don't know, planting a field of 100 apple trees, and after 1 year cutting all but one down, thinking, you know, that one's going to be the one that bears the most fruit. So you've got to be very careful how we do it, and we've got to be aware of the effect that this can have on kids as well. And there's a lot of evidence out there. Just to go into some of that evidence, we have evidence that early specialization can mean social isolation from friends, from peers, from within school, within family units. I was talking to a colleague, a PhD student, who's doing work in elite golf at the moment, and was saying one of the things they've noticed is that there's an awful lot of social isolation on young elite golfers because it's such an individual sport, and that's having huge effects on mental health. There becomes an overdependence on adult control. So you are reliant on either your parents or even the coach to run and manage what you do. And those people may not be appropriately qualified or have the experience to be able to do that. So we have to be very careful. There's the issue of burnout. And again, not just physical, but social and psychological burnout. There's manipulation by adults through misinformed judgments. Going back to the idea that the more you practice something, the better you get. No, that's not true. The more you practice something, the more likely you are to get an overuse injury from doing that activity. So we have to be very careful of that. And talking about injuries, we have overuse, overload injuries, where young children are pushed to do something before their body is physically able to do it. So, for example, in gymnastics, there's an awful lot of wrist injuries, and kids who have wrist problems or have developmental problems from what they've been doing. So we have to be really, really careful. Now, we may be talking about the snowflake generation at the moment, but we have to be aware of what the adult applied views of specialization can do to people. There's the reality of making it. The reality of making it is, again, looking at things like professional football in the UK, is if you're in a professional football academy, if you make it to that level, you still have a 0.015% chance of making it when you look at the statistics. So your chance of making it is infinitesimally small. So we have to be very careful how we get that message across. By all means, get kids to enjoy the game, get them to engage, give them opportunity, give them a context to play in, give them all the social support and things they need. But we need also to give them the reality of what can happen. Now, I think there are a couple of video links that were sent out to you to have a look at. Whether you have done or not, I'm not sure yet. There's the fantastic one about Meet the Parents, which I absolutely love. And there was a really interesting one very recently from over here, looking at the football academies and pushy parents and academies trying to sell dreams. So we have to be very, very careful of that. And as I've said already, the evidence is that increased sport-specific practice does not equal increased performance. So Melina looked at this and did a review of a number of studies from a medical perspective that have looked at sport and came up with these findings. Other medical, more recent, where they looked at the physiological characteristics, what they identified was actually focusing on one sport at a young age was bad entirely. Poorer age-appropriate sports skills, inability to develop wider neuromuscular patterns, increased risk of injury, increased risk of burnout, increased psychological disengagement, and a decreased chance of developing wider coping strategies. So it's not just sports strategies, it's much, much wider than that we have to be aware of. And even the medics have got involved in this debate as well, and are saying, well, hang on a second, the evidence is you have to be really, really careful in what we're talking about. Recommendations they highlight are actually that team sports, the age of specialization should be middle adolescence. Arguably, if you look at early adolescence and you look at the early specialization of gymnastics, diving, and figure skating, then you could say that the majority of those are actually have been are socially constructed because we're getting a younger and younger age group. But there are a number of gymnasts, has been proven recently, recent Olympics, who are much older and have managed to achieve elite status at that age. So we have to be quite careful on this. The recommendations all say about, yes, engage at a young age and engage throughout adolescence, but also do other activities. Some of which, as we'll see later on, where you can link in the particular sport-specific skills and gain something through that process. So I think what we've got to be really careful of is not pushing kids to specialize early, because everybody develops at a completely different rate. And the important it doesn't. But if you have an early specialization system, then you lose your late bloomers. And actually, when you look at it, it is your late bloomers who tend to be the ones who become your best elite performers. The way to stop this process is to allow all the kids as much opportunity to engage in multiple sports to gain specific skills. You may find, oh, football might lose, but I don't know, rugby, for example, might win. So what we're doing over here, and I've been working with a couple of academies over here, is they're now setting up relationships with other professional sports academies, so that actually the kids they coach, or the groups of kids they coach, are part of a wider system, a multi-sport system. So ultimately sport wins. They might lose somebody to rugby, but conversely they might gain somebody from rugby. So we cannot be precious. We do not own these kids. We have to think about this engagement really, really carefully. So okay, the counter argument, what's the value of diversification? Well, the excellent Jean Coté, who based over at Queen's in Canada, has done quite a lot of work on this, and a lot of my work follows on from what Jean's done. And what he's identified through the evidence is that diversification does not hinder elite sports participation. So actually playing more sports, playing multi-sports, actually has a beneficial effect. It's linked to a longer sporting career, which is actually what we are ultimately all after, because the more we can keep kids engaged as adults, the more likely they are to, it becomes quite Darwinian if you think about it, the more likely they are to encourage their kids to then play and engage, the more likely clubs are to continue, because they have people around them, enough kids to help become next coaches, next administrators, the next organizers, the next officials. And that's ultimately what we need to do. We are just caretakers after all. So diversification allows them to engage in a longer sporting career. It allows them to learn in a wider range of contexts. Now, one thing I'm becoming more interested in is what you can gain from being qualified to coach a number of sports. So what you can learn in different contexts, you can apply across sports. And I think that's a really important thing. It allows kids to experiment, learn and play. And if you think about the skills that you can gain, that you can pass between sports, so we're going to look at skill transfer in a little while, then that becomes quite important as well. What can you gain from one sport that you can apply to another? It allows the increase of wider motor and cognitive skills. But importantly, I think, especially for this is that Cote highlights that sports specialization should be recommended at the age of 16 only. So again, this idea that they should be playing multiple sports to gain multiple skills, to avoid injury from overuse, when you can strengthen your players by doing a number of sports, becomes really important. Now, I would love to know, and it'd be great to have a conversation at the end, whether playing ice hockey and football actually reduces the number of ankle injuries in kids playing football, because they strengthen, and from a young age they will strengthen their ankles from doing ice skating, compared to the UK where we don't. So I would be fascinated to find out if there's a prevalence of injuries around that. But because they're doing something that is not related, but it's something that's cultural, then it becomes a really important skill to do. So we need, this whole point about understanding that cultural context and where it fits for you, your local scenario, as well as the Canadian scenario as well. Loads of evidence on this. If you look at the work that Villiers have done reviewing all this, you can see there's evidence from Russia in there. We've got evidence from Germany. Lots of sports and activities that suggest that the later you specialize, the more likely you are to succeed. And this is a big thing that we need to do and engage with parents in particular to consider. Okay, so that's some of the wider context. We've actually done a little bit of this in the UK, because we have a number of issues over here, and we sampled just over 1,000 UK sports people, and we looked in particular at key ages, the ages of 11, 13 and 15, as well as 18, which was the key age that we were sort of basing this on. And what we identified is that if you actively played at organised club level 3 or more sports around the age of 11, 13 and 15, you were significantly more likely to compete at national representative level in one of those sports. So the more sports you play, the more likely you are more sports you play for longer, the more likely you are to compete in one of those sports at a later age. Now, what we're beginning to understand now is that there is skill transfer between sports. So not only are we allowing kids a healthier diet so they don't get fed up of one activity, of one context, of one sport, one opportunity, one place, one coach, one set of friends. We're giving them a healthier diet, if you like, but we also begin to see that there are opportunities to transfer skills between sports. And that's where things are becoming really, really interesting now in the research that's out there. So that's what we did. So what we're trying to do again is suggest we don't have to, as long as we provide an opportunity, then we can allow our kids to engage in whatever sport they're interested in, and allow them to perform at the level they want to for as long as possible. We don't need to push them. Kids can make the decision themselves. We've just got to be very careful. We can educate the parents not to push them at too young an age into doing one particular activity. Okay, so where are we now on this? Well, there was a recent mover here who looked at all of the studies around sporting talent. We looked at 296 studies from across the world around everything to do with talent, and in particular around specialization and sampling and play. They noted that the key to reaching super elite level was involvement in diverse sports during childhood, and then appreciable amounts of sports specific practice and training in late adolescence and adulthood. So again, even the review evidence suggests that the longer we can allow these kids to sample diverse sports, the more likely they are to achieve at elite adulthood. And that again is this key message about engagement. It's lifelong engagement. Whether they make it or not as an elite performer is by the by, but the fact that they've been involved, they've engaged for a long period of time becomes really, really important. Even that was published last year, they reviewed the early versus late specialization evidence. And the conclusion was skill development is key, and later sports specialization as well, around about the ages of 15 to 16. And they also highlight as well that sports specialization may be appropriate in unique situations, but only after the development of specific skills, abilities, and psychological maturity. So yes, there may be a case for some people to specialize early, but we need to make sure that those who do are capable of doing that and managing that whole process. So we have to be really, really capable, really, really sure. And if we're not sure, then we need to make sure that the opportunities are there for them to engage in multiple sports, not just focusing on doing more of sports, but maybe we can think more cleverly about what sports and what activities they begin to do. Okay, so I know people are desperate to find out what's the evidence from football. Well, the first thing I'll say about football or soccer, whichever way we want to define it, bearing in mind we're across the pond from each other, is we have a biased sample in football. The majority of research that's been done, particularly in the UK, is focused on kids who have been forced to specialise early. It is only now in the last couple of years where we have academies who are now realising that actually they're losing kids are burning out, they're not getting the best kids because they're forcing them to just play football and not do any other activities. So we're beginning a slow sea change, unfortunately, that we have to go through, because we shouldn't have this in the first place. In 2012, when they began to look at this, they identified there was very little research out there. It was not a topic that the football clubs or the FA or other organisations really wanted to promote, because they didn't want to suggest, in case they lost players, that kids should do a number of different sports or activities. But what they did identify is there's talent transfer coming in now. So you can gain, you can get talent transfer from other sports that could be useful. What we need to know a little bit more about would be, okay, are there particular sports and are there even particular positions on the field of play where this might be important? And we'll mention that a little bit later on. But there's also a need for understanding about how other sports can support skill development. So I like to call this strategic sampling. So sampling a lot of activities, but actually, are there particular ones that would be really useful in particular for soccer or other sports in particular cases? Now, I can think of a few. You may also be able to think of a few out there where you can begin to see how these things might link up, if you can do, and then maybe think about ways your club can link up with that sport or a related club and begin to share some of these activities in what you do, or at least open opportunities for kids. But as I said at the start, the problem we have with football or soccer is often it's biased, as diversification and playing multiple sports has been discouraged, and certainly has been historically. So we've, in the UK until recently, kids part of academies were not allowed to play any other sport, and they were not even allowed to play football or soccer for their school. So we're beginning this slow sea change. We are very much behind on this, particularly behind Europe, as we'll see later. A couple of weeks has looked at the whole context of talent identification development in male football, and they reviewed 70 studies from over almost 3,000 about football from across the world, highlighting that predicting performance at a young age is difficult. and therefore understanding the determinants requirements for success are complex, they're non-linear, and they're multifactorial. So it is very, very difficult to predict elite performance. But more importantly, they also talked about two key research papers as well. One from 2012 looked at players from across the world and highlighted that actually they both followed early and late specialization pathways. Interestingly, it was mainly the England players who followed the late specialization, whereas those from, followed the early specialization, whereas those from Europe tended to follow the late specialization pathways. And another study again in Germany, in the Bundesliga, looked at a number of players over there and found that the majority of those were late. They were multi-sport performers, but they were also late specializers. And if you look at the German football squad, even if you look at the Spanish football squad, and you look at the systems and the way they run things, they're all multi-sport organizations, and most of their clubs are. And that, I think, is the strength of them. That's why they're so dominant now at the world level, especially when they have fairly small populations. The population of Germany and the population of the UK are fairly similar, and yet Germany are head and shoulders above us when it comes to football. And there are a number of reasons for that. If you look at Iceland, having beaten us in the Euros with their tiny population, and yet they are multi-sport. So we need to begin to think about the power of this multi-sport opportunity and how we can manage that and deal with it. But this isn't something that the academics just noticed from the research, because it's a statement when it comes to young player development, and that is around the importance of giving lots of play opportunities in age-appropriate sport-related activities and settings, and actually allowing them to experience as many settings and opportunities as possible in order to gain success at some level. Be that success on a personal level, sort of on a personally referenced excellence, elite referenced excellence, or even just participation for personal well-being, because we're talking about creating I don't want to use the word pyramid, but a pyramid of performers who are going to be lifelong performers. Well, there will be a few who make it, but a large number who are playing because they enjoy it, because they want to, because it keeps them fit and healthy, and they can socialize. And that becomes really important. Oh, a very quick anecdote. I have played five-a-side football in my sort of local small town for the last 15 years. And I'm in my, oh my gosh, I'm in my later 40s now, and I'm the youngest there. So we've got guys up in their 60s and approaching 70s who are still engaging, who are still playing, who have a love for the game, and they're the ones who've been engaged in helping the local community clubs and engaged in playing at that level. So we're looking at long-term engagement from, if you like, a multi-sport opportunity. Okay, so where are we going with this? I guess we're going towards this idea about understanding. What we do know is that there is a negative correlation between early specialization and senior success. And there's a positive correlation between late specialization and senior success. So the earlier you specialize, the less likely you are of making it as an elite performer as an adult. The later you specialize, the more chance you have of making it. So what we're beginning to look at is, okay, if there is this idea that you can specialize later, what are the key motor skills and what are the key areas you can focus on? Well, there are clearly things within sports that you can gain. So people changing position, people changing when they play as they grow and develop. One of the things I think soccer has a big problem with is, from a young age, stereotyping somebody happening maybe from their height when they were the age of 7 or 8, and then being stuck in that position because that's the position they play, whereas they should be moving around all positions and experiencing that opportunity. But also this idea about skill and talent transfer across sports. So where can we go? Where can we take people from one sport and put them into another sport? And that's where, if you like, we've been successful in the UK when it comes to, with Team GB, when it comes to some of our Olympic sports. So at a macro level, what have we got? So we've got some good and a few very simplistic skill-based examples, which you can probably identify fairly easily. Going from rowing to cycling, so we had Rebecca Romero, the double Olympic gold medalist, who in, I can't remember which, it was at Athens, won gold medal in rowing, and then Beijing won a gold medal in cycling. You've got people who've gone from sprinting, who haven't quite made it as sprinters, to going and doing bobsleigh or even skeleton bob. Thinking of the Winter Olympics coming up. We've got ice hockey, inline skating to speed skating, and vice versa. You've got gymnasts who've gone into diving and trampolining and across all of those. So there clearly are characteristics between sports. What we need to do is identify these for soccer in particular, and in the cultural context of where you are. Now, I've been really fortunate. I've spent a few years working with the PGA, working with golf, and also colleagues in Canada as well. And looking at this, we know the other sorts of activities that are very useful for golfers now, because we've profiled hundreds of Category 1 golfers, and to find out what other sports they were playing. And interestingly, table tennis comes top. Now, I'm not a physiologist or biomechanist to know quite how that's working, but clearly there's something about table tennis. Maybe it's could be the size of the ball, who knows? But it's the side-on motion, it's everything you're doing that becomes really important. What is fascinating though is actually snooker and pool become really important. So you can imagine on putting, the ability from a young age to have played snooker and pool and actually understood the weighting of a ball, about how you hit a ball for it to get somewhere, becomes really important. And you can see that as well as angles and getting that right. So you can see that would have a natural place in the game of golf. There's also racket sports. So squash and badminton have an effect. So we're beginning to realize that actually if we set up a system where all our golf academies also do table tennis, snooker and pool, racket sports, bit of football, whatever else, then we may be lucky enough to create a really good golfer. But at the same time, we might actually find an Olympic table tennis player or squash or badminton player. We're lessening the risk. We're increasing the options for these guys to actually learn what skills they are from a young age and what they can get out of it. But against all of this, you have to still, what parents often want, and how they push and what they do. And we need to think very carefully about the message we can get out there. And one of those messages really is, okay, how can we understand how this is done elsewhere? How is this built in? Well, to use one example, probably one of the greatest football clubs in the world. Now, Barcelona is a multi-sport club. You go to Germany, you look at Bayern Munich, you look at some of these other clubs, they are all multi-sport clubs. So the kids who would have gone to these clubs also played all of these activities, or certainly had the opportunity to play. So you can see at Barcelona, wow, this is amazing. I wish we had this over in the UK. This is the idea they're going. And now, interestingly, over the last couple of years, Manchester City have created their own multi-sport club. And Manchester City aren't doing too bad in the Premiership at the moment. Now, we're talking about the future, so we're talking about things that we will not see the result of now, but we will see the result of maybe in 5, maybe 10 years. But we can't sit and wait and carry on with what we've been doing over that period when we know the evidence suggests we need to increase this engagement. We know coaching diversification becomes important. So actually having coaches who are qualified in multiple sports could be quite useful, especially if those multiple sports are related in some way. We know that using coaches from other sports gives a different perspective. So not just doing soccer, get a field hockey coaching, get an athletics coaching, get a rugby coaching, get a volleyball coaching, and do a session. Mix it up a little bit. Give the kids a break, an opportunity to do something else, not just soccer all of the time. And also the thing that we need to identify is, okay, what are these key activities and what are they for soccer skill development? Now, I think this is where it becomes really important, because this is where you need to put this into context. And you need to think about how you can do this at a very local level, because not everybody will have access to other local clubs. So you have to think quite creatively at club level, at a micro level, how you can build this in. There's no point in doing a Barcelona if you can't do a Barcelona, if you don't have the facilities. So you've got to think creatively about how you can manage this. Okay, getting towards the end, I've got a few things for you to think about, and this is the problem, I guess, that and this is the problem of the media and certainly social media and what people come upon. So our dear friend Tiger Woods. Tiger Woods was on TV at a very young age, seeing a golf ball, hitting a golf ball. Everybody I've come upon has always said, well, Tiger Woods played golf at a young age. Absolutely he did. But he also played basketball and athletics until his mid-teens. It is very easy for people to be selective. I don't wish to bring in the word fake news, but it's easy to see that information can be misjudged or selectively used. Michael G also basically baseball until he went to university. In the UK, and I think probably one of the highest paid sportsmen anywhere, certainly in the UK, if not anywhere in the world, motor racing driver, Formula One driver, seen on TV at a very young age doing radio control cars, then doing karting at a young age, and then winning the Formula One World Championship. But nobody takes into account that he was also a belt in karate at the age of 12, and he played a decent level of football to academy level as a teenager. But it's also, what do those activities give? Can you imagine the karate, the strength, the core strength from karate that will have helped him when he was doing motor racing and kart racing? So we need to better understand all of these things. One of the greatest all-rounders, and sorry to be very English here, is the South African cricketer AB de Villiers. One of the best cricketers in the world. AB de Villiers, national records in swimming and athletics. He played tennis, badminton, rugby and football to a high level as a junior, and is also a scratch golfer. Now, again, he may be an extreme example, but it gives you an idea that perhaps there are things about the mentality of playing lots of sports, about what you learn as an individual from doing this, as well as the physical skills, the mental skills that you can then put together. Now, clearly, this is going to be a cultural context, because if I would say to you, well, actually, all soccer players need to play cricket in Canada, then that's not going to work. So you need to know about the cultural context that you're in for that to be effective. Be careful. It's also the women. So Elise Perry, an Australian, and soccer, has played World Cup cricket and World Cup football. So again, there are links. You shouldn't make people choose until they're ready to choose. And then coming back full circle, if you like, back to soccer. Jack Butland. Now, Jack Butland was one of the players who came out of Birmingham City FC, a club I've been doing some work with around looking at this issue. And Jack is a really, really interesting example of somebody who played football, obviously, for England until he was injured, but a top-level goalkeeper who actually we know got his skills as a goalkeeper from another sport, and that was actually playing rugby. Now, if you think about the characteristics of rugby, being able to throw yourself towards other players, dive at people's feet, dive towards the ball, be aggressive in that sense, you can see there's a mentality in here that would work. So part of me is thinking, actually, and I know rugby is played in Canada, are there some really good rugby players who would make fantastic goalkeepers? But they may not have had that opportunity, and vice versa. Are there some goalkeepers who may make some fantastic rugby players? Ultimately, if you want to be selfish, then we'll say, no, I want to keep all my players myself. But if you want to think about the future of sport and the future of the national game, either game, then maybe we should allow them to develop and give them that opportunity. Okay, and we're out of time. So what could your club do? Well, perhaps look at creating partnerships with other sports, if that's feasible. And they may not be sharing facilities, it may be sharing opportunities to do taster sessions, work out how they could engage. Is there some strategic sampling you could do with certain age groups? Are there particular skills you could do? One of the simplest, actually, is juggling. Now, juggling, and there's a guy called Tagler Marsh who's done some work with this. He does a lot of work actually in Premiership teams. One of the research that he did was around juggling and peripheral vision in professional soccer. Juggling's fantastic because it gives you a great idea of peripheral vision. Now, getting kids to learn to juggle is a great skill anyway, great motor skill, but actually getting them to juggle as well as be able to control and kick a football will give them an immense number of skills. You've got things like ballet or skating or boarding or martial arts for balance. You've got the best example of all. You've got ice skating. And think about that for balance and what that can do and the strength that comes out of that for ankles, knees and everything else. And that opportunity becomes really important. So are there things you could do that can increase this opportunities to sample? Not just sport, but almost beyond sport, if you like. It's an opportunity for you to share ideas, experiences and plans. Yes, you may compete against each other as clubs, but that's the only way that we can create better players. Be aware of the power of skill and talent transfer, because that's really, really important. This is an area of research that's growing even more now. We know it happens, we know it works. We can be more strategic with it, perhaps. We know, for example, that if you want to become a top-level shooter, pistol shooter, then you need to have a strong wrist. A way of getting a strong wrist is to play sports like badminton. So we now know that we need to link those two together. So are there things that can work within particular sports or even particular skills within particular sports that you can gain? I think looking at the research evidence that's out there, and there is more that needs to be done. The research evidence hasn't stopped. We need to understand an awful lot more about this, but we need to allow the younger age groups to sample as many sports as possible, not just play 2 sports or 3 sports, but as many as possible, and try where possible to avoid early specialization, to give those kids the chance to bloom in 1 or 2 or 3 of those activities. And this is the important thing. Go back to my early quote. Don't allow your child just to focus on one subject at school because they don't know what they're going to be good at a later age. Allow them to try all of them, or as many as possible, and then specialize at a later date. If you can have a system, as they do in Europe, that promotes that from day one when you join the club, then that's a lot easier. If you haven't got that, we need to think of a way of reverse engineering it. My time is up. I realize I've gone slightly over. Thank you very much. And do we have any questions? And before I finish that, I will a snapshot of those and some of the papers that I accessed for this presentation if anybody wants to have a look at that. Apart from that, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Martin. Really appreciate that. We've got a question here, one from Jennifer, if you could answer that, asking, what is the frequency of training that is considered early specialization? So is it determined by age, gender, or sport? So thinking specifically there around soccer.
Oh, that's a really good one. Evidence-wise, we don't have any evidence on that. What we tend to have to work with at the moment is whether they're focused on it. I think we have to be very careful, in particular, certainly at younger ages, about kids playing too much sport and certainly doing too much of the same thing. So this is the idea about doing a varied diet. So if you have kids at a young age who want to focus on soccer, I would encourage them to do a number of other activities to help them physically develop a little bit more. So actually, as part of their fitness for football, get them to do swimming, as an example. Now, it's not particularly football related, but it will allow them to develop stronger limbs, muscles, joints, everything else at the same time. I think one of the issues we do have is age-wise is very difficult because people develop at different rates. Determining and giving a key number is always a very difficult thing because people develop so differently. And I think you would need to almost do it on an individual basis. If you know what the other person's doing, then fine. If that person's doing a range of sports and activities, a healthy range, then I don't think there's any problem with them doing sort of as much frequency of training, and I wouldn't call it training, I'd call it engagement. But when it's training, I think we're really talking about focusing just on football for that entire period, or just on soccer for that entire period. So I don't think there's a clear answer to that. There's certainly no easy answer to that one, but I think we've got to think about it from that individual's perspective, perhaps also what their position is, what they want to do, what other activities they're doing. So it's very much an answer. The answer is there is no clear answer or clear guidance yet. But when it comes to specialization, we are really talking about purely focusing on one sport from a young age. I hope that may have answered that.
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the things we see in Ontario is we see children signed up to multiple programs, multiple competitive or development programs where they might say play soccer 3 or 4 times a week and maybe supplementary soccer training, and then adding to that different sports. So I guess what everybody's kind of wanting to get a look around is, what is too much? Is it important still for them to have downtime and engage with other things? Does it all have to be signed up in order to be a multi-sports athlete?
No, not at all. Actually, that's an interesting point. I think what we often forget, and I think as coaches we get tied up with, is that we have to do training. And if you go back to Jean Cotet's work and this importance about deliberate play, allowing kids to play is probably far more beneficial than coaching them. Because one of the things we begin to notice now, as certain sports over here, golf being a classic example, is the more we tell kids what to do, the less they can problem solve and learn on their own. We can't be on the pitch with them. So I would actually encourage, in a sense, some training, but more opportunity for them to play, learn, and engage themselves rather than doing too much. So I think a problem where you have too many schemes that are focused on training is they do too much training, and training is a reason for dropout. Because the research evidence going into educational research, the more you have adults telling kids what to do, eventually the less chance those kids have actually got of engaging.
Okay, thank you. Just for anybody still listening, if you do have any questions, please feel free to write them in the question box, and we will ask them to Dr. Toms. Again, going into it in Ontario, we find our challenges with the climate. So again, a question is we see almost seasonal sports. Is that something that would be recommended? So maybe in the winter they focus on a winter sport, like hockey, skating, or whatever. In the summer they may focus on soccer or another sport where they play outdoors. Is that something that would be recommended in terms of development?
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the things that is very useful is to have that, like you said, the downtime, the chance to think, okay, I know when my season's ending, I know when I can start doing something else. And we do have that blurring now of seasons and things. But I actually think you have a great opportunity, because thinking of skating and the balance you can get from skating will be fantastic for loads of other activities. One other example, when I've been working at Birmingham City, they had 2 under 14 players, I think they were, who came over from Norway. The family moved over and they got engaged with the academy system, and they had better balance and coordination skills than some of the under 17 players from the UK. They wanted to find out why. Well, I mean, pretty much you could surmise that actually those kids in Norway were born on skis. They skied from a young age, so they had amazing balance. And they were streets ahead of some of the other kids, because the kids here weren't doing it because the club said, no, actually, you can't do risky activities like that because you might get injured. So actually, we're doing some of our players a disservice. We're probably causing some of those injuries because we're stopping them from being able to engage in activities that would actually help support and reduce the risk of injury. So I think things like skating, I think that would be absolutely ideal. Now, if there's a chance of also doing in the winter, and I don't know if when rugby unions played over in Canada and we're quite where it's played, but that might be quite an interesting one as well. So are there ways of engaging with this?
It's interesting, Martin. You talk about playing other sports and everything like that, and I know you talked earlier in the presentation about sharing the children and that we don't own the children. So, in terms of cross-sport links, is that something that you could see us going down, where communities start to almost merge together rather than having single sport clubs, almost a multi-sports club? Is that something that you'd recommend?
I think, yeah, absolutely. I think that's where we've gone horribly wrong in the UK, because we have single sport clubs, which means we force kids to have to make that decision, or we force parents. And that becomes really problematic because it gives multiple sites for activities to take place. Whereas actually you could have one site and you could do, I don't know, you could do soccer on a Monday, you could do tennis on a Tuesday, you could do athletics on a Wednesday, whatever, in the same place. So the kids can get more of an opportunity to play. It saves money because you don't have to have so many facilities. The facilities would always be in use. And you'll also get more engagement from them because they'll also create a stronger social network. And I think that's something that we are missing out on here. But in Europe, they're very, very strong on. And we've got to think about that because we're missing a trick here.
It's interesting. We've just got a couple of comments through. One's from Lynn Job, who works for the Active for Life, and she's based out of Calgary. And she said that recently she heard a coach tell a parent, more than anything else, kids just want the parents to play with them. So that's, again, something important where we talk about, rather than a specialization, and you talk about engagement, is that something, again, that's important where, parents are going outside or on the park and playing different sports with them rather than just signing them up to a program?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really a really important one. It goes back to what I was saying earlier, because if we're going to go down this Darwinian view where if we have fewer parents playing sports, then we're going to have fewer kids because the parents don't know how to play that sport or activity. So we need to create these lifelong players to keep the whole thing going. And certainly as a way of playing, I mean, I learnt my sport, maybe not from my father, but from my brother in the back garden, in the backyard. And that's what got me involved in it. And there's an awful long story I could say about that. But that's important. Yeah, absolutely, the family is central to this. And in a sense, you could argue that putting kids into these programs is nothing more than simply glorified babysitting or a guilt complex.
It's interesting that leads up perfectly to a comment from Ryan, who says there seems to be many who feel that our country lacks a soccer culture because children aren't specialising in soccer early. And Ryan works in the school system here in Ontario, and he asked, do you think the school system is the primary route to start educating parents and community groups on the pitfalls of early specialisation?
Yes, I think so. We obviously do have different issues within schools as well that can be challenging, such as relative age effect and things like that we also need to get our heads around. But yes, certainly. But I think it's fine for schools to say it. It's fine to educate the children to say actually that you could play for longer. I think we also, as coaches and as clubs, we also have that responsibility to try and do that at the same time. I noticed one of the other comments about the 10,000 hour rule in there, which again is one of the worst things that's ever come up. And is poor old Anders Ericsson being misquoted and people jumping on that and assuming that 10,000 hours is the only way you can become an expert. It's not, and it doesn't guarantee you expertise anyway. So we've got to be careful, and 10,000 hours is still quoted. There is an international football federation that now calls it 10,000 touches. And yet there's no evidence for 10,000 hours whatsoever, apart from in music. It's just been misquoted. So this is again another issue of one of those bits of fiction that becomes true and becomes ingrained in our culture. And that's something else we can educate parents about.
So another question was asked by John Hyland, one of our learning facilitators and coach developers for Ontario Soccer, and he asked, is it important to play both invasion and non-invasion sports for diversity?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know if it's about it being important, but I think it will be a useful diet for kids to understand the difference between, if you like, individual sports and invasion games. I think if you're going to look at particular skills that you could link together, I think that would be quite good. So it might be that you had, if you want, or if a child is very keen to be a team player, you might look at team sports versus individual sports. So you could see racket sports could be useful as a bit of, I don't know, warm down, a bit of training, whatever else. But they may give particular skills that you might then introduce to invasion games at the same time. So I think it will depend on the particular context. But I think a healthy diet will include invasion games if that's what they want to do, as well as individual sports, as well as even sports like golf, for example, can teach people an awful lot about their own characteristics. Again, difficult in different climates. But I think I think it's a really interesting question. I think it will go down to probably to the individual, to what they want to do.
Interesting, and this is something as well that which could help us out massively. Obviously, I'm pretty focused on soccer in Ontario, but again, to your knowledge, I know you work with other sports. Are there any strategies? This is a final question that we'll ask you tonight by Sean. Are there any strategies in place to provide multi-sport opportunities with other groups in order to develop player skills? So are there any other sports which are out there that are advocating for multi-sports, or are they using any strategies to do this in order to develop their players?
I think particularly in the UK, we are national governing bodies, federations are becoming very aware that specialization doesn't work, and they are beginning to set up relationships. So the example I mentioned earlier about Birmingham City, Wasps Rugby, who play in the National Premiership, and Warwickshire County Cricket Club, who are one of the top county cricket clubs in the UK, they've put together at a local level this sort of partnership. So it's beginning to happen slowly. In most other countries in Europe, it exists already because they're multi-sport clubs anyway. So the federations all have to work together. So we're beginning to get our heads around it, but we are light years behind many other, certainly European countries on this. But I think that gives us a good advantage because we can then work out what we need to do and how we can get it right. I think you've got the advantage in Canada of doing exactly the same thing. Can you work out where your strategy could be? Can you work out geographically what the context is of what other clubs you have around you that are willing and engaged to be able to do that? So for me, it makes perfect sense for things like ice hockey, soccer, rugby to work together. In the same way, it makes perfect sense for me for volleyball and handball and basketball to work together.
Yeah, for sure. It all makes sense. And I always say to some of the soccer coaches, could you imagine you could say you were Wayne Gretzky's soccer coach, for instance, just because they had success in another sport doesn't necessarily mean, that you failed. I'm guessing, as you touched upon before, you can see success, from transfer from one sport to another.
Absolutely. And I think so. One last thing is we must really think about these kids are kids who have the opportunity to engage in multiple sports and possibly become an expert, become an elite performer in one, if not more of them. But if we don't give them that opportunity, if we allow them to specialize early, we will never know.
Yeah, for sure. Martin, finally, just thank you. Thank you. A huge thank you. I know it's almost, you're already on Thursday. It's almost 1 a.m. where you are. So we really appreciate the time and sticking around, especially at the end to answer questions. It is really appreciated. For those asking, this webinar will be available online in the next couple of days on the Ontario Soccer website. Please stay registered and stay in tune on Twitter, on the Ontario Soccer newsletter for information. Dr. Martin Toms would appreciate any, and ourselves at Ontario Soccer would appreciate any feedback. So at the close of this webinar, I will ask you for a feedback form. And last year, we were lucky enough to have Dr. Martin Toms present at the Ontario Soccer Summit. This year, the Ontario Soccer Summit is on March 2nd to March 4th at Seneca College. So please feel free to register for that as well. We've got many good speakers coming up. And we've also got a few webinars, which are just to be confirmed. Some of the people that Dr. Martin Toms tonight referred to and as references are in line to present as well. So we're looking to bring in external speakers. And again, wherever they are in the world, we'll try and link them up. But a massive thank you to everybody for joining us. Dr. Martin Toms, thank you again for joining us. If you've got any final words, we appreciate that. If not, go and have a beer and enjoy your evening.
No problem. And just thank you to everybody for engaging and listening. And do keep in contact. Do drop me messages. Happy to try and answer any questions, point you in direction of research. And actually, if anything else, help bang the drum if you need it for trying to give these kids as much opportunity, engagement, and help support development of kids. And also educate coaches, ourselves and parents about what we can do to help give these kids a better chance of becoming elite performers. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. If there are any questions for Dr. Martin Toms, you can contact him also directly on Twitter. But thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.